occupational risk of scientists is to get involved in some narrow sort of stovepipe topic and forget that it's only important insofar as it's part of a big picture. And the people in general public, they ask the big questions.
Hello and welcome to a brand new series of the Research Comms podcast. I'm Peter Barker. I'm very excited to be back, and I'm looking forward over the next couple of months to exploring once again with you the theme of research communication in the digital age. I'll be doing that through speaking with a number of guests, all of whom are doing particularly inspiring, innovative work in the field of research communication. People who are committed to engaging the public, policymakers, industry with the latest cutting-edge research in an effort to ensure that that research has the impact it deserves and that it can help us to overcome some of the greatest challenges that we face today. One man who is acutely aware of those challenges is this week's guest. He is an absolutely towering figure from the world of science. Astrophysicist, Astronomer Royal, former President of the Royal Society, Lord Martin Rees. Lord Rees has been highly active in the field of science communication for many decades, and although he developed his reputation and much of his career around his work as an astronomer, looking from Earth into the outer reaches of space, in recent years his gaze has drifted back to more earthly matters, in particular to his concerns about some of the risks and threats that humanity faces today.
Even though the Earth has existed for 45 million centuries, this century is the first when one species, namely the human species, has the power to affect the entire planet.
His latest book, On the Future, Prospects for Humanity, is a reflection of those concerns. It's also a rallying cry for scientists to become more actively engaged themselves, to take seriously their responsibilities as communicators in order to help the public to understand the threats that we face, with a view ultimately to influencing political action in order to deal with those challenges. So a few weeks ago, I visited Trinity College in Cambridge and sat down with Lord Rees to discuss not only his latest book, but also to look back on his career as a scientist, as a science communicator. I started our conversation by asking him about what it was that fired his own early enthusiasm for public engagement. In the book, you talk about the Cold War period and how close we came to all-out nuclear war. Perhaps we were unaware of how close in many cases, and that you were involved as a student, going on vigils, going on protests, calling for nuclear disarmament. I was interested to know how formative was that period for you in terms of realizing the responsibility that scientists have to communicate the science and engage the public around technologies such as nuclear technologies?
Well, of course, that was a big issue at the time, where we realized that the scientists had created something during World War II that did really change the world. And that was my first realization about the impact of science. And I was lucky in the 70s and 80s to get to know some of the great men, and they were all men, who had worked in World War II at Los Alamos and who had then returned to civilian life, but had felt committed to trying to harness the powers they'd helped unleash by campaigning for arms control. People like Joe Rotblat, Hans Bethe, etc. I had the privilege of getting to know them in their later years, and I admired them very much. And the first aspect of science policy I got involved with was indeed arms control. I went to Pugwash conferences, etc. But that led me to realize that there are now more and more areas of science which have a huge possible impact, most obviously molecular biology and genetics there. So I'm not an expert in those, but I got involved. But of course, I professionally became an astronomer. And astronomy is, of course, a science which is fortunate in many ways. First, it's got a positive and non-threatening public image. People are ambivalent about nuclear power or genetics, but I think if you talk about astronomy or evolution, people are positive about those two things, and that's a plus. And also, a wide public is fascinated. If you say you're an astronomer, you'll get interesting conversation going with many people. in a way you wouldn't with other sciences. Yeah. And so it's a subject where there is a great demand for communication at a general level. And I think throughout my career, I've tried to see it as part of my role to meet that demand. And I have found it a plus, because not only does it widen your impact and your range of contacts, but I think it's more satisfying if you can talk about your work not just to a few colleagues. You need them, of course, for the details, but if there's a wider range of people who are interested in what you're doing, and that's a stimulus. And also, it's important because the occupational risk of scientists is to get involved in some narrow sort of stovepipe topic and forget that it's only important insofar as it's part of a big picture. And the people in general public, they ask the big questions. And of course, when we're scientists, we ought to be aware that the big question of what's important, even though we realize that we can't tackle the big questions head on. We've got to tackle them in a piecemeal way. But the risk is that by tackling a problem in a piecemeal way, you forget that it's only worthwhile insofar as it's part of the big picture.
Absolutely. And so that was, whilst you're working as an astronomer, obviously your interests were those, your specialist area or interests were those sort of outside of the earthly realm, looking out into the cosmos. But then in recent years, and it sounds like you never entirely abandoned these interests, but in recent years, certainly your focus has been, your gaze has wandered back to Earth. And so through the books that you've written, Our Final Century and your recent book, which is about to come out, but by the time this episode goes out, I'm sure it will be already flying off the shelves, which is On the Future Prospects for Humanity. You are particularly concerned by certain technological advances that you feel pose a grave risk to not only the environment but the future of humanity itself, and also through the you've also established the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, exploring these themes as well. So was it something that particularly that happened that shifted your focus back to these issues?
Well, not really. I mean, I hope I've been a concerned citizen in many respects, and interested in politics. But what happened really was that I had opportunities to get more involved in politics and policy, particularly when I served for 5 years as president of the Royal Society, which is the Academy of Sciences for the Commonwealth, but has a remit to cover all of science and its policy implications. So that gave me both a motive and an opportunity to get somewhat better informed about a whole range of scientific areas that I was not an expert in. And then I became a member of the House of Lords, which further gave me that opportunity. So I think the way my career developed was I continue to see myself as a researcher, but I've spent a lot of time in these areas and exploring broader policy questions. That's why I've been led to give many lectures and write articles and write a book, and indeed, as you mentioned, to be involved in setting up a sort of policy centre which focuses on these big risks, which may be of low probability, but could be of very high consequence. And as regards the things that I worry about, which I address in the new book, which is a follow-up to my book called Our Final Century that I wrote 15 years ago. The new book is called On the Future. Sounds a bit pretentious, but that's the title they gave me. There are really two concerns. They both really reflect the fact, which as an astronomer I'm very aware of, which is that even though the Earth has existed for 45 million centuries, this century is the first when one species, namely the human species, has the power to affect the entire planet. And there are two ways in which this can happen. One is the collective effect of humanity, because there are more of us. Population is 7.5 billion, will rise to at least 9 billion by mid-century, and we're each more demanding of energy and resources. And that's why there is a growing concern about the effects on the climate and on biodiversity, etc. So those are issues that we need to be concerned about, and they're politically challenging, but they have to be tackled globally. The second class of issues, which in fact I think I first highlighted in my old book, is that new powerful technologies empower small groups in a way that was not possible in the past. As I put it, the global village will have its village idiots, but they will now have a global range. And I'm thinking of biotech and cyber and AI, where, as we already know, it's possible for a few people, even an individual, to have a huge cascading effect by error or by design. And this is a new class of concerns we have, and I think a very severe challenge to governance to cope with.
So it seems like you have a sort of two-pronged approach to trying to reduce the risk of these issues. One is to gather together great minds, experts across a field range of disciplines to sort of assess those risks and come up with hopefully solutions of reducing the risks. On the other hand, is through this book and your various talks and so on, is to, I think, as you said, enhance the political and public discourse around these threats. But it's not that easy a task, is it? I think because of in some cases, they feel like, even though in the grand scheme of things, the risk is potentially quite imminent, getting people, politicians, members of the public to care about things that are going to happen in a few generations' time or even in a couple of generations' time seems to be quite a challenge. Why do you think that is?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first, you're quite right in saying that we set up a centre because we think these extreme threats are understudied and there ought to be a few people studying them. And here in Cambridge, which I would say is the number one scientific university in Europe, we really owe it to the public, I think, to spend a bit of time using our convening power to try and address these issues, because if we can reduce the probability of these events by even 1 part in 10,000, we've more than earned our keep, because the stakes are so high. So that's why we're doing that. But I think, why is it so difficult? The challenge is especially severe in things like climate change, because I think everyone knows that there's at least a serious threat that by the end of a century, irreversible tipping points will have been crossed, etc., and we ought to take action now to minimize that risk. But the problem, of course, is, as you mentioned, that these are long-term threats. There's no immediate threat, and we can be lulled into complacency. It's not like something where you immediately see this. So, for instance, we insure our house, even though our house has a small chance of burning down, which we are aware every day of other houses burning down. Whereas when we're thinking of a disaster for the entire world, then, of course, if we wait to observe it happening, it's too late. So we need to think about what might happen, even when we don't have any experience of it. So there's the problem that it's hard to make people care about something which hasn't yet happened and which may not happen for decades. So that's the problem. And the other problem is that some of these topics, like climate change in particular, have to be handled globally. And, of course, when politicians have a focus mainly on the short term and the local, and what happened before the next election, to get them to focus seriously on what may happen to people in a remote part of the world 30 or 50 years from now is very, very hard. And I think the only way that this can be done effectively is by public opinion. We've got to make the public concerned because politicians care about what's in the press and they care about what's in the inbox. So we've got to ensure these topics are on the agenda. And that's why, and I mentioned this in my book, I think the world's religions have an important role. And I think a fine example was the papal encyclical Laudato Si, which came out in 2015, just 6 months before the Paris conference. And that had a big effect on public opinion and on the opinion of political leaders, especially in Latin America, Africa, and East Asia. And the Pope, with his billion followers, had a big effect. And whatever one thinks of the Church, no one can doubt its long-term vision and its global range and its concern with the world's poor. And that's why religions can be important, and if their adherents exert political pressure, that can make a difference, because it's very hard to make people care about these remote long-term questions.
Making people care, encouraging them to care is the first hurdle, perhaps, and the second hurdle is, once they do care, helping them to understand what the sort of implications of some of these technological advances might be. and they're happening so rapidly at the moment. There's such a sort of speed of change and the scale of things that are happening. Do you worry that it's happening so fast that it's going to be, I always believe that, the members of the public, as I am one of, are capable of understanding things, generally speaking, if it's explained to them in the correct way to sort of tailor to their understanding, previous understanding. But is there a danger at which things are now escalating so rapidly that it's going to be difficult for people to comprehend some of these technologies in the same way I was thinking with the global financial crash, for example, with all these kind of crazily complex financial derivatives that seem to take even the experts by surprise? Is a similar thing happening perhaps with some of the kind of emerging technologies?
Well, I think that is a worry, and that's why expert groups like CISA are important to try and alert politicians to these issues which aren't obvious to the general public. But I think even if we can do that, then to actually act in a way that produces the risk is a political challenge. And we've got to remember that scientists have expertise in a particular area. Outside that area, they are just citizens, but they do have a special responsibility to ensure that anything they do understand or discover is not used in a damaging way. And so that's why they can do it. But it is a big challenge.
You mentioned scientists acting in a responsible way. I think that's one of the interesting things as well about the era that we're going through now is whereas once we had organizations, government-backed organizations like NASA who are doing a lot of this sort of research and development in certain areas, now there are a lot of commercial organizations, and some of them, Google DeepMind springs to mind, do take their responsibility, their civic responsibilities seriously, and they're looking to engage the public with what they're doing. But it would probably be naive to believe that all commercial enterprises have the same level of awareness of how they should be behaving. Lots of stuff happening behind closed doors. How do you bring them into debates like this?
Well, with great difficulty, and I think this issue is most acute in the biotech area. There was a famous conference in the 1970s at Silliwan, California, when the technique of recombinant DNA was introduced, and they got people from all the leading labs in molecular biology together to decide on a sort of moratorium on some types of experiments, etc. And they were actually rather overcautious in what they thought then, but anything they recommended was actually enforced. There has been an effort to have similar meetings, often organized by international academies, to address all the new issues of gene editing, modifying viruses and all that, which are now very scary indeed. And these are well-intentioned, and it's very important that they happen because they will help to reduce the risks. But things are very different now for reasons you've alluded to. First, the effort in research is now more global. It's not just a few people in North America and some European countries. It's global. And there are very strong commercial pressures. And the worry is that for those reasons, and also incidentally, because many of these techniques are increasingly widely understood and require facilities which are available in many university labs or industrial labs, I am pessimistic about sufficiently effective control and regulation. We can apply regulations as best we can, but I think we'll be as unsuccessful in eliminating these dangers as we have been in enforcing the drug laws or the tax laws globally.
I should point out that even though you mentioned you're pessimistic there, that you do regard yourself as an optimist in terms of what the capacity of, well, human capacity and the capacity of the technologies that we're devising to overcome some of these issues, even though the threat is great.
Oh, indeed. I think it's very important that technology, of course, has been crucial. I mean, we couldn't live our present-day lives without the application of technology. And even with present technology, we could make a better world for the 7.5 billion people now in it, particularly for the bottom billion. And the fact that we're not doing that is an indication of the gap between what could be done with technology and what is being done. And this is a political failure and an ethical failure. And of course, what makes me pessimistic is not the technology. I'm optimistic about technology, but I'm pessimistic about the way in which it's applied And I worry that the gap between the way we could make things with new technology for everyone and the way things will actually pan out is going to get wider rather than narrower. So that's my main concern.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to think about occasions where technology has great potential, but perhaps the example I'm thinking of is, for example, with genetically modified foods, with the global population pressures that are increasing and food security becoming an issue. The potential for genetically modified foods. I think you speak about golden rice, isn't it, in the book of the nutritional value for kind of developing nations. There's an example of a time when there was the public debate around GM was flawed, I think, wasn't it, really? Scientists got on board perhaps a bit too late, by which point the debate had
there's a contrast between the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, in the United States, there wasn't much debate, whereas in Europe, of course, there was a debate because opinion got polarized between Monsanto on the one hand and environmental campaigners on the other, with the result of the suspicion, which is still lingering about these technologies. And that's an indication that one does need to engage with the public. And I quote in my book a better example, which was embryo research, where the researchers did engage with politicians and came up with a fairly good set of guidelines for what you can do with embryos and what you can't. And that's been accepted up till now.
And mitochondrial donation as well.
That's right, the so-called three-parent families. So those have been examples that have worked well. But GM crops didn't work well. But despite the fact that 300 million Americans have eaten this stuff with no necessarily bad effects, that's not regarded as evidence that they're safe.
There's also the aspect that you mentioned in the book regarding not just genetically modified foods, but sort of genetic modification in general, the technologies around that you describe there the yuck factor, I think you say, about that people feel when they hear about scientists creating sort of rabbits that glow in the lab. You also speak about the dread factor associated with radiation.
Yes.
Those are two very sort of emotional responses that people have. And I think that's an issue that scientists and experts in general often have when it comes to communicating ideas, that they put out facts, they put out statistics, they put out information, but sometimes there's just emotional responses that people have that kind of override those. And that makes it challenging for scientists and experts, but also it means on the flip side, it can be manipulated by, those kind of emotions can be manipulated by those who might have sort of, I say more sinister purposes. But in the news at the moment, there's the information about Russian hackers spreading anti-vaccination sort of polemic on the internet that seems to be influencing opinion. So, and that sort of, generally speaking, is quite emotionally based sort of messaging, I think.
Yes, so that's a sort of dread, isn't it?
Exactly, again.
People don't know what the effect is. That's rather like radiation.
Instant fear, exactly. So is there a way of overcoming that as scientists, as experts trying to communicate?
Well, I think by communication and trying to gain confidence of the public in a way that the GM people did not in Europe. That's one thing. But going back to the yuck factor, I think one shouldn't dismiss this, because I think many of us do feel that we have a certain responsibility to the natural world and to the way we treat animals, etc., and that this is something which we should realise. I mean, I think factory farming is a great evil, may be recognised as such, and one feels that animals have certain, well, using the word rights, of course, leads to problems. But they certainly, one feels, should be allowed to fulfil their natural potential, and we do feel that about animals, and that's why the circus animals, etc., are now an idea that we don't like so much, because we feel it's not in their nature to be used this way. And incidentally, going back to the Pope's encyclical, I think it was also important because it was the first time a Pope had said that we have a responsibility to the natural world. I mean, Franciscans have said this in the past, but the official doctrine has been man has dominion over nature.
Yeah.
Whereas this particular encyclical actually did say more explicitly that we had a responsibility to preserve the biodiversity. And of course, this is a very serious concern now, with the extinction rates rising. And I quote in my book the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, who said that if actions this century cause mass extinctions, it's the sin that future generations will least forgive us for.
Yeah.
Because it's an irreversible impoverishment of our environment.
That's interesting, I think, as well, isn't it? Sort of, if we can find stories that perhaps connect us with future generations, for example, in a way that at the moment we feel slightly emotionally detached, then that could be...
Well, that's right, because one of the problems is short-term thinking, and we should realise that most young children today will be alive at the beginning of the 22nd century. And so we ought to think that far ahead, which, of course, economists don't, because if you apply the standard discount rate, which you would apply in deciding whether you're going to put up an office building, etc., then you discount what happens more than 50 years, well, more than 30 years ahead, probably. Right. And so one has to use a slightly different subjective discount rate and not discriminate on grounds of date of birth. We should care about the life chances of a baby just born as much as of someone who's now middle-aged. Yeah. And that should allow us to think long-term. And we should also, I think, be motivated by realizing how much we owe to previous generations. I mean, we know that we depend not just on the literary and artistic heritage, but on all the Victorians did to build our infrastructure. And here we're sitting in a college that looked the same more or less for 400 years. And so we should be grateful to our forebears. And it would be shameful if we didn't leave as our legacy something which had a long-term future. Yeah. And of course, one reason why perhaps people don't think long-term is because everything is changing much faster. I give in my book the example of the cathedral builders. Yes. They lived in a world where they thought there'd be an apocalypse within 1,000 years, so they had a short horizon, but nonetheless they put bricks on a building that wouldn't be finished in their lifetime. Yeah. And the reason they did that was that although they thought the cosmos had a short horizon, they didn't think there was rapid change. They thought the life of their children and their grandchildren would be the same as theirs. Whereas now it's the other way around. We've got a huge horizon, billions of years if you're a cosmologist. But on the other hand, we can't be confident of the sort of life experience of our children or our grandchildren. Yeah. So that's one reason I suspect why we are unwilling to make sacrifices now and build long term.
Yeah, fascinating. In the final chapter of your book, you call on scientists to become more engaged, to become more concerned, and to engage with sort of public and political debates around these kind of issues. I just recently, for another episode of this podcast, spoke with, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, the social psychologist Jonathan Haight, who's an American social psychologist.
Oh, Righteous Mind.
Yes, Righteous Mind, exactly, his concern at the moment, he's got another book coming out, is with the polarization of experts who are, he's now a centrist, but he says that the universities, especially in America, are very sort of left-leaning, and that when experts get involved in political debates, they're normally seen as being on the left, which is potentially threatening the credibility that people on the other side of the political spectrum, the trust that they have in those experts, because they're now seen as sort of carrying a political agenda. You yourself, you're a member of the Labour Party, so presumably you have never seen a conflict between the work you do as a scientist with your sort of political activism. But do you think, how can scientists who perhaps are a little bit wary of entering the world of politics as they might see it, I suppose, how do we not muddy the waters and end up with scientists becoming polarized or associated with one side of an argument, especially around things like climate change that are so politically loaded?
Well, they shouldn't be, because it's an issue. It's primarily an issue of science and how concerned we should be about the future, and it is an issue where economics and ethics comes in. The point is that I think the main debate between those who support our government's climate policy and those who don't, it's not particularly skepticism about the science. It is a matter of how much we should sacrifice now in order to make life safe for people at the end of a century. It's a case of a discount rate. And in particular, an example of Born Lomborg, who's a bogeyman among some environmentalists because of his book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. And he runs something called the Copenhagen Consensus, which consists just of economists. And they rate climate change as far less important than helping the world's poor in other ways.
Right.
And they do that because they apply a standard discount rate. And obviously, if you do that and don't give any weight to what happens after 2050, you will say this is not important to do with climate change.
Yeah.
Leave that to our descendants. So I think that's an example where it's a debate. I don't know whether you call it left-right, but it's a debate which involves ethics and economics, not so much science.
Yeah.
But that is an example. I think I'm unapologetic about being on the left, and I believe in greater equality, and in believing that the biggest limitations on freedom in this country are suffered by the poor, because they have no job security, they can't live in a decent place, etc. And so I think we do need massive redistribution. And incidentally, I think when we consider the effect of AI, it's going to be very important that the people who lose their jobs because those jobs are taken over by AI are given other opportunities, and the prime opportunities for them are going to be in the caring professions, which now are under-resourced and under-appreciated. So there's got to be massive redistribution of wealth in order to fund huge numbers of respected and secure jobs for carers for young and old, custodians of public parks, teachers' assistants and things like that. And this is something which I suppose you would say that's something which those on the left would support more than those on the right. But I'm unapologetic in being on the left and feeling that we've got to get away from the idea of the small state being virtuous and admire Scandinavia more than the United States, which is the opposite of what some politicians do.
Yeah, and I suppose going back to what Jonathan Haight was saying, actually his point is that not really that scientists shouldn't be on the left or right, just that it's healthy to have voices on both sides to debate the issues and work out what.
But I think the other point in his first book was really to realise that there are sort of general ethical constraints and value systems which are broader and more extensive than those which utilitarians would adopt, and it's the latter which are focused on by those on the left.
Yeah. Final thoughts for those who are inspired, who take up your call to action, scientists and experts across all disciplines really, to get more involved. Over the years, as a science communicator involved with public engagement, what advice can you give them for sort of effective methods of communicating often complex issues to the public?
Well, of course, the opportunities are far greater now through social media, and so I think to be active on social media is clearly a plus. But I think it's in the interests of all professionals to get involved in debates that extend beyond their professional colleagues, especially when their work has a broad impact. And so I think it's not only something which makes the work more satisfying, but which is more important. And I think we are in a world where a lot of the choices we have to make, which are important for the world's future, do have a scientific dimension, be it in the area of health, energy, or environment.
Yeah.
And I think people can't be experts, but they ought to have enough feel for those subjects and for probabilities and numbers to participate in the debate, which otherwise won't get beyond the level of newspaper headline slogans. And so I think that's crucially important, and that's what we as educators can try to do, to make sure everyone has this background and that science is not just for potential scientists, it's for everyone. And also the other point I'd make, going back to being an astronomer, is that astronomy is the grandest environmental science. It's a fundamental science, but it's a global environmental science because everyone throughout history has gazed up at the same vault of heaven and interpreted it in different ways, and it even more easily than other sciences manages to cross all barriers of faith and nationality. And so that's why science is beneficial in bringing people together and spanning divides.
And you also mention, I think, again in the book about the first times we went beyond, and the photographs that were being back of Earth, sort of putting it in its context, that has been hugely beneficial.
That's right. That has had an impact, and of course, astronomy is pursuing. And one of my goals, although I won't be alive, is that by the anniversary, the centenary of that image, which will be in 2068, we will have an image of another Earth-like planet orbiting another star. We don't yet have that, but we have telescopes that will do that, and that will again widen our horizons.
Yeah, wonderful. He's hoping.
And can I say one other thing, which is that the other particular perspective which astronomers have more than other specialists really is an awareness of the far future. Most people, unless they are creationists, are happy with the idea with the outcome of 4 billion years of evolution. But most of them somehow tend to feel that we are the culmination of it all. And no astronomers could believe that, because we know that the Earth has billions of years ahead of it, and the universe still more. And so we shouldn't think of ourselves as a culmination, but we should nonetheless think that we are at a especially crucial time, a especially crucial century, because what happens this century could be a transition to a completely different form of life, maybe electronic life in the far future, or we could, through malign choice or through simple misadventure, stymie all those future potentials by destroying the civilization we now have.
A great deal at stake.
Yes.
And people can read about all of these ideas and more in the book, which I urge everybody to go and buy now, On the Future, Prospects for Humanity, which is available in print, audio, and what was the other format? Print, audio, and
iBook.
And iBook.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much. What a way to start this second series. And it's just the start. There are going to be many more episodes to come, each one with another fascinating guest. Do subscribe if you haven't done already, and also, if you like, sign up to the Research Comms Digest, which is a monthly newsletter showcasing all the finest research communication content from around the web. Next week, I'm going behind the scenes at the Science Gallery London, speaking to some of the people who are instrumental in bringing that project to life. Fascinating stuff. I hope you'll join me. Speak soon.